Imagine a civilization so sophisticated, so alive with colour and commerce and complexity, that it dominated an entire sea for centuries. Grand palaces filled with painted walls, ships carrying wine and oil and bronze to ports across the ancient world. A people who built Europe's first great cities, and left behind art so vivid, so warm, so unmistakably human, that you can stand in front of it 4,000 years later and feel like you're almost remembering something. And then imagine all of that going quiet, not slowly, not gradually, but within the span of a few generations. The palaces abandoned or burned, the ships gone, the language unspoken, the people themselves folding into history so completely that the world forgot they had ever existed at all. That's the story of the Minoans. They lived on the island of Crete, at the crossroads of 3 continents, where the eastern Mediterranean funnels into trade routes and sea lanes that connected Egypt to Greece to Anatolia. For roughly 1,000 years, from around 2000 BCE to somewhere around 1100 BCE, they were arguably the most powerful and culturally sophisticated civilization in all of Europe. Not just powerful in the way we usually mean it, armies and weapons and conquest. Powerful in influence, in trade, in art, in the sheer organizational complexity of how they ran their world. And yet, we barely know them. Their ruins survive, their paintings survive, their palace complexes, some of the largest and most intricate structures of the ancient Bronze Age, still draw visitors to Crete today. But their full story remains tangled in questions we haven't been able to answer cleanly. Who were they really? What did they believe? How did they govern themselves? And what ended their world so thoroughly that for more than 3,000 years, almost no one even knew they had existed? Those are the questions we're going to sit with tonight. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever hour it is where you're resting, I'd love to know. Leave a comment. Someone in Athens, someone in Auckland, someone in the middle of the night in Chicago. We're all drifting toward the same ancient mystery together. To understand why the Minoans became what they became, you have to start with the island itself. Crete is long and narrow, stretched out like a spine across the southern edge of the Aegean, roughly 160 miles from one end to the other, but rarely more than 35 miles wide. Look at it on a map and something immediately becomes clear. It sits almost exactly at the center of something. To the north, mainland Greece and the scattered islands of the Aegean. To the east, Cyprus and the Levantine coast, where the great civilizations of the ancient Near East were already writing in clay and building cities of mud brick. To the southeast, Egypt, one of the oldest and wealthiest societies the ancient world would ever produce. To the northeast, Anatolia, the vast landmass that would eventually become Turkey, rich in copper and obsidian and ideas. Crete doesn't just sit near these places. It sits between them, right in the middle of the conversation, the way a natural harbour sits at the mouth of a river. Everything moving through this part of the world eventually had to reckon with Crete. Geography has a way of shaping what a people become, and Crete's geography shaped the Minoans profoundly. The island isn't uniformly hospitable. A jagged spine of mountains runs along much of its length, the White Mountains in the west and the Dictee Range in the centre, rising to peaks high enough to hold snow in winter. These mountains aren't just dramatic scenery, they're a defining feature of how Cretan society organised itself. They created natural barriers between regions, sheltered inland valleys from the worst of the Mediterranean winds, and fed rivers and streams that made lowland farming possible. The fertile plains around Knossos in the north, around Phaistos in the south, around Malea to the east, these became the agricultural heartlands of Minoan civilization. Olive trees thrived on the terraced hillsides. Grapevines spread across the warmer slopes. Grain grew in the flat river valleys. The island wasn't paradise, but it was productive, varied, and rich enough to support populations far larger than most Bronze Age societies could have imagined. And then there was the coastline. Crete has one of the most articulated coastlines in the Mediterranean, full of natural bays and sheltered coves and rocky promontories that break the wind and calm the water enough for small ships to anchor safely. For early seafarers, working with nothing more than oars and simple sails, these natural harbours were everything. They were the difference between surviving a crossing and not. The Minoans didn't just find these harbours. They built around them, extended them, made them the beating hearts of their commercial world. But before the palaces, before the trade networks, before any of the grandeur we associate with Minoan civilization, there were simply people. The island was first settled long before the Bronze Age, possibly as far back as 7000 BCE, by farmers who made the sea crossing from Anatolia in small boats with animals and seeds and the knowledge of how to grow food. They built villages, they buried their dead. They worked the land in the slow, patient way that early agricultural communities always did, generation after generation, learning the rhythms of a particular place. For thousands of years, Crete was simply an island with people on it, productive people, increasingly organized people, but nothing that would have distinguished them from dozens of other Bronze Age communities scattered around the eastern Mediterranean. What changed, gradually and then dramatically, was the sea. Sometime around 3000 BCE, the Aegean world began to stir. Trade networks were thickening across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Egypt was consolidating into a unified kingdom. The cities of Mesopotamia were trading copper from Cyprus and cedar from Lebanon. Anatolia was becoming a source of metals that the entire ancient world wanted. And in this expanding web of exchange, Crete's central position stopped being merely a geographical fact and became a commercial advantage of enormous consequence. The Minoans didn't conquer the sea lanes, they worked them. There's an important distinction there. The evidence we have, and we'll talk more about what that evidence looks like as we go, suggests that Minoan influence spread not through military force, but through trade, through the slow accumulation of relationships, through showing up in port after port with goods that people wanted and the ships to carry them. Minoan pottery has turned up in Egypt, in the Levant, in Cyprus, in the Aegean Islands. Egyptian records mention a people called the Keftiu, almost certainly the Minoans, bringing gifts or trade goods to pharaonic courts. Cretan obsidian and bronze work spread in patterns that track with commercial networks, not military campaigns. This matters because it tells us something important about who the Minoans were before they were a civilization with grand palace complexes and famous art. They were sailors, traders, people who looked at the water between themselves and the rest of the world and saw not a barrier but a road. The palaces would come later. The paintings would come later. All of it grew from this, from the decision made somewhere in the deep past to push the boat out and see what lay on the other side of the horizon. At some point, over many generations of sailing and trading and planting terraces on the hillsides, the villages along Crete's fertile plains began to change. Fields that had once been managed by individual households started to be coordinated. Storage that had once been a few jars in a family storeroom grew into something larger and more centralized. The movement of goods in and out of a valley became too complex to track in someone's head. You needed places where crops, oil, wine, wool, crafted goods, and perhaps even people themselves could be gathered, counted, blessed, and sent back out again. Those places are what archaeologists call palaces, Knossos in the north, Phaistos above the southern plain, Malea near the north coast to the east, Zakros far out toward the island's eastern tip, close to sea routes heading for Cyprus and the Levant, each one sitting in or beside a fertile basin, each one within reach of a harbour, none of them quite like the palaces you might picture in your mind. If you could walk into Knossos during its height, around 1700 to 1450 BCE, you wouldn't enter through a single grand gate into a neat rectangular courtyard surrounded by high defensive walls the way you might in an Egyptian or Near Eastern royal compound. Instead, you'd approach a maze of low, sprawling buildings that seem to fold into the landscape rather than dominate it. You might start along a paved road that narrows into a corridor, then widens unexpectedly into a broad open court. On one side, tall, tapering columns painted in deep red and black hold up an upper story. On another, doorways open into shadowy storage rooms. Stairs disappear upward and downward. Light wells cut down through multiple floors, pouring sunlight and air into the interior. Long, L-shaped corridors lead to rooms whose purposes you can only guess at now. shrines, reception halls, archives, living quarters, workshops. The architecture is complicated, but strangely fluid. There's a sense that movement was meant to flow through these buildings like water through an irrigation channel. At the centre lies what many scholars see as the heart of each complex, a large rectangular courtyard, oriented roughly north-south, open to the sky. Knossos has one, so do Phaistos, Malea and Zakros. These courts weren't empty spaces. They were stages where much of palace life, and perhaps much of Minoan ritual, unfolded. Imagine the courtyard at Knossos on a busy day. Men and women crossing its sunlit surface, some in elaborate garments with flounced skirts or kilts, others in simpler working clothes. Officials moving from one wing of the building to another with tablets in their hands, craftsmen bringing finished bronze tools or decorated pottery from the workshops to be inspected and recorded. Farmers from nearby villages arriving with baskets of grain or amphorae of olive oil as part of their obligations to the palace. Some mornings, the space might be filled with quiet administrative hustle. Other times, it might host public ceremonies, processions, perhaps even the famous bull leaping that decorates so many Minoan frescoes. The same architectural features could serve multiple purposes, shifting with the rhythm of seasons and rituals and economic cycles. Beneath and around this courtyard beat the economic heart of the palace. If you step away from the open court at Knossos and move down into the western wing, you pass along a series of long, narrow rooms. Archaeologists call them magazines. Their stone floors are lined with the cut-out footprints of massive storage jars, pithoi, that once rose to your chest or your shoulders, their bellies holding grain, wine, oil, pulses, dried fruit, perhaps even textiles or scented unguents. Thousands upon thousands of litres of goods could be stored here at a time. Malea and Phaistos have similar magazines, rows of parallel rooms, often with raised thresholds and careful drainage. The sheer scale suggests that these were not private storerooms for a single family, even a wealthy one. They were repositories for an entire region's surplus. Goods flowed in from villages scattered across the plain. Olive oil pressed in rural farmsteads, wine fermented in hillside installations, wool shorn in upland pastures, grain harvested from the valley bottom. All of it converged on these palace centres, where it was received, measured and recorded. We know this because of something seemingly mundane, but immensely revealing: clay tablets. In rooms adjacent to storage magazines and administrative areas at Knossos, scholars found hundreds of small tablets written in a script we call Linear B, used in the final centuries of the palace's life under Mycenaean influence. Earlier, there had been another script, Linear A, which we still can't read. The contents remain partly locked away from us, but the pattern is clear. Lists, inventories, allocations, names of people or places, quantities of grain, animals, oil, manufactured goods. The palace, it seems, was an engine of collection and redistribution. Farmers and households likely brought a portion of their produce and products to the palace as some combination of tax, rent, and ritual offering. Palace administrators, scribes really, noted down quantities and destinations. In return, the palace provided things that individual households couldn't easily produce on their own: bronze tools made from imported copper and tin, fine textiles, pottery, perhaps even seed grain in lean years, or rations for workers and specialists. Some scholars describe this as a redistributive economy, where a central institution gathers resources and then sends them back out according to its own logic. Others caution that we shouldn't imagine a perfectly planned system. The reality may have been messier, more flexible, with multiple centres: Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, each managing its own hinterland while also trading with the others. In any case, these palaces were more than glamorous houses. They were administrative hubs, archives, warehouses, and ritual centres all at once. Around and within them, production thrived. Walk along the eastern side of Knossos or around the edges of Malea, and you'd likely smell the tang of wet clay and the sharp bite of metalworking. Workshops clustered near palace walls, potters shaping and firing the distinctive, elegant Minoan vessels, metalworkers hammering bronze into tools, weapons and ritual implements, artisans carving sealstones or working ivory, faience, and semi-precious stones into jewellery and miniature sculptures. Some of these crafts may have been directly under palace supervision. Others could have been more independent, simply attracted to the security and steady demand that a major centre offered. Either way, the palace complex wasn't quiet or isolated. It pulsed with the constant low hum of work. The social world behind all this activity is harder to reconstruct. Somewhere within these buildings, in suites of larger, more elaborately decorated rooms, with frescoed walls, pier and door partitions that could be opened or closed, light wells and private staircases, there must have lived people who held power. Maybe you'd call them kings and queens, maybe high priests and priestesses, maybe something more fluid and layered than any single title can capture. We don't have clear royal portraits or long inscriptions like those of Egyptian pharaohs, naming their achievements and tracing their lineages. Minoan art avoids the obvious focus on individual rulers that you see elsewhere in the Bronze Age. Power here feels more diffused, more embedded in ritual scenes and processions and communal gatherings than in a single exalted person holding a sceptre. But hierarchy almost certainly existed. Above the farmers and shepherds and fishers who brought goods to the storerooms, there were officials who received and checked them, scribes who could read and write the palace scripts, an elite skill that conferred authority, overseers of workshops, people responsible for coordinating shipbuilding and trade, religious functionaries who presided over ceremonies in small shrines within the palace or in sacred spaces on nearby peaks and in caves. You can imagine a vertical world. At the bottom, the steady labour of agriculture and craft. In the middle, administrators and specialists keeping the system running. At the top, a smaller group whose power came from control over both the sacred and the economic life of the region. But the exact shapes and relationships within that hierarchy remain blurry, glimpsed only through architecture, inventories and art that rarely labels its figures. What's even stranger, especially if you're used to thinking about ancient power in terms of walls and armies, is what many of these palaces do not have: massive fortifications. There are exceptions, and the picture shifts over time, but for long stretches of the Middle and early late Bronze Age, the big Minoan centres don't show the kind of heavy defensive walls that surround Mycenaean sites on the mainland or near Eastern and Egyptian cities. Knossos sprawls openly across its hill. Phaistos commands a view over the southern plain but doesn't hunker behind towering stone ramparts. Malea and Zakros sit near the coast, integrated into their landscapes rather than sealed off from them. This absence has puzzled scholars for decades. One interpretation is that the Minoans were unusually peaceful, their power resting on trade and cultural influence rather than war. Another is that their defences were simply different, relying on natural topography, watch points along coasts, fleets that could intercept threats at sea, or lighter structures and materials that haven't survived. The truth may involve all of these elements. Crete's mountains and fragmentary plains naturally break the island into regions. A threat approaching from the sea would have had to navigate not only currents and winds, but also the watchful eyes of coastal communities whose livelihoods depended on those same waters. The palaces themselves, with their complex interiors, narrow corridors, and multiple levels, might have offered some defensive advantages even without great outer walls. A place that feels open and fluid in peacetime can become a maze to an intruder. Still, compared to other Bronze Age centres, there's a sense that the Minoan palaces were designed less as fortresses and more as open-ended hubs, nodes in a network rather than castles on a frontier. Daily life around them reflected that openness. At dawn, farmers from outlying settlements would begin the walk toward the palace, donkeys laden with sacks of grain or amphorae of oil. In the early light, the silhouette of Knossos or Phaistos would appear on the hill ahead, terraces and roofs catching the sun. By mid-morning, the outer courts and nearby streets might be crowded with people arriving and departing, shepherds bringing wool, fishers delivering their catch to palace buyers, traders unloading imported goods, copper ingots, tin, fine stone, from small harbours downstream. Within the complex, scribes sat in shaded rooms, inscribing damp clay with reed styluses, fingers stained and practised. Couriers moved between rooms, carrying tablets, seals, and messages. Priests or priestesses prepared for rituals in enclosed shrines, laying out offerings, dressing in particular garments, perhaps performing purifications before stepping out into the more public courtyards. In the workshops, potters shaped elegant cups and storage jars, repeating designs they'd inherited and subtly modified. Metalworkers tended their furnaces, feeding charcoal, watching the colour of the flames. Textile workers spun and wove, turning wool and imported fibres into cloth that might end up in distant ports, a Minoan signature in foreign markets. Children ran through alleys on the palace's edge, dogs slept in the shade, smells layered in the warm air, baking bread, heated metal, crushed olives, perhaps incense burning during a ceremony nearby. As the sun climbed higher, activity in exposed courtyards might slow, people retreating to cooler interior spaces. Administrative work continues in dimmer rooms carved with benches and storage niches. In some periods, we know that rulers or officials held audiences in larger halls, rooms whose walls bore frescoes of landscapes, processions, and mythical creatures. People would enter these spaces after passing through twisting corridors and courtyards, their route carefully choreographed, their experience of space guiding their emotions and sense of significance. Later, as evening falls and the heat drains from the stones, the palaces might come alive again in a different way. Torches and oil lamps flicker in upper stories. Music drifts from somewhere within. A pipe, a drum, the clatter of dancing feet on plaster. The same courtyard that hosted the morning's deliveries and accounting now holds a small ritual or a communal meal. These complexes were never static monuments. They were living machines of stone, wood, and plaster, shaping and responding to the rhythms of the communities that built them. From a quiet harbour, you might look up at night and see the palace on its hill, lit in scattered points where lamps burn, the dark mass of buildings almost merging with the land. You'd know that behind those lights, decisions were being made about where the next shipment of oil would go, how much grain to release in a lean year, which rituals to perform at the next turn of the season. No single person built this system. It grew over centuries from the choices of countless people, farmers and sailors, craftsmen and priests, scribes and rulers, each one moving through those open courtyards and winding corridors, each one finding a place within this strange, sophisticated world of palaces without walls. From those hilltop palaces, the world beyond Crete was never just an abstract idea on the horizon. It was tangible, almost routine, brought close by the steady movement of ships and goods and stories. If you lived in a coastal town like Malea or Zakros, the smell of the sea was mixed, every day, with the smell of trade. Imagine standing at a small harbour on the north coast before dawn. The sky is still a deep grey, the sea a darker sheet beyond the curve of the bay. You can hear the low creak of wood as a ship rocks against its moorings. Long, narrow, with a high curved prow and a low stern, its hull is made of planks, laboriously shaped and sewn or pegged together, sealed with pitch. A row of oars rests inside, ready to be shipped out through openings along the side. When the wind favours you, a square sail can be raised on a central mast. But most of the time, human muscle will do the work. On the beach, men and women move quietly around piles of goods waiting to be loaded. Amphorae of olive oil, their narrow necks sealed with clay stoppers and resin. Large jars of wine from inland vineyards. Flavours shaped by the particular limestone of a Cretan hillside. Sacks of grain and pulses. Bundles of fine woolen cloth, carefully folded and tied, the result of countless hours of spinning and weaving in town and countryside. Boxes or baskets holding smaller, more precious things. Worked bronze tools and weapons cast in moulds in palace-adjacent workshops. Seal stones carved in intricate designs. Finely painted cups and jugs, whose thin walls and flowing shapes mark them as something above everyday pottery. These goods represent more than surplus. For some households, they're the result of obligations to the palace, paid in kind. For others, they're part of private ventures, pooled investments in the hope that trade will turn them into something more. Imported copper, tin, exotic stones, Egyptian faience, perhaps even gold. The harbour is where all those hopes meet the unpredictable realities of sea and weather. A captain moves among the stacks, consulting with a scribe. The scribe holds a small lump of damp clay in one hand, a stylus in the other. With quick practiced strokes, he presses signs into the surface, not pictures of ships or waves, but abstract marks from a system we call Linear A. To him, they're not abstract at all. They're specific words, quantities, perhaps names of merchants, officials, or destinations. To us, they're a closed door. We can see that he's keeping track of something, the number of jars, the type of goods, which portion belongs to the palace, which belongs to a private trader. But we can't yet read the story he's writing. The goods are loaded carefully. Amphorae are wedged tight with straw and rope against the curvature of the hull, because a shifting cargo at sea is as dangerous as a sudden storm. Rolled textiles and baskets fill gaps. A few jars of especially fine oil or wine might be stowed near the captain's bedding, destined as gifts or samples for foreign buyers. Once everything is in place, the crew climbs aboard. Rowers who know the coastline by heart, sailors who can read the subtle change in wind on the water's surface, a few armed men, because not every encounter at sea is friendly. As the first light spills over the hills, the ship pushes off. Oars dip in unison. The bay falls away behind you, the palace shrinking to a pale shape on its hill. Ahead lies not open empty water, but a network of routes, as well known to these sailors as mountain paths, are to inland shepherds. You follow the north coast of Crete for a time, keeping land in sight. Bays, promontories, familiar rock formations act as landmarks. Small coastal settlements appear and vanish, a cluster of houses near a sheltered cove, a watch point on a cliff. The ship might put in briefly at another Cretan harbour to take on more cargo or passengers, then continue east or west. At some point, when the captain judges conditions right, you strike out across a wider gap, heading toward the Cyclades, the Greek mainland, Cyprus, or the distant low line of the Egyptian shore. Bronze Age seafaring wasn't reckless plunging into an unknown void. It was calculated risk, guided by cumulative experience. Sailors watched stars at night, the colour and movement of the water by day, the flights of birds that often hinted at nearby land, the smell of the air that could shift subtly with changes in current or temperature. They knew where currents might push them off course, where sudden winds tended to rise in the afternoons, which islands offered fresh water and safe moorings. In your cargo hold, Minoan goods aren't anonymous. The painted pottery carries distinctive patterns, spirals, lilies, marine creatures, that friends and rivals across the sea have come to recognize. The textiles have particular weaves, colours and weights. The perfumes and scented oils, stored in small elegant flasks, blend local plants in recipes guarded by specialized producers. To a trader in a port on the Greek mainland or the Levantine coast, these things aren't just useful. They're part of a style, a way of life associated with Crete. Evidence of these journeys lies scattered across the Bronze Age world. At sites in the Cyclades, in mainland Greece, in the Levant, archaeologists uncover Minoan pottery in layers that date to the 2nd millennium BCE. The shapes and decorations match those from Cretan workshops. In Egypt, on the walls of tombs belonging to officials in the New Kingdom, there are painted scenes that show people bringing gifts and tribute. Among them are figures who look, to many scholars, very much like Minoans, men in flounced kilts, women bare-breasted in tightly fitted bodices, all with dark hair and carefully arranged clothes, carrying vases decorated in unmistakably Cretan styles. Are these literal portraits of Minoan emissaries stepping into Egyptian courtly space? Or stylized images, Egyptian artists' generalized visions of foreigners from the islands? The answer is probably somewhere in between. But however we read them, they confirm a basic reality. There were connections. Ships from Crete, or from places closely linked to Cretan traders, reached the Nile Delta. In return, objects marked by Egyptian craft and symbolism found their way back to Cretan palaces. Carved hippopotamus ivory, faience beads and small vessels, scarabs with hieroglyphic names, fragments of Egyptian stone vessels reused and reworked. Farther east, in the ports of the Levant, Cretan goods mingled with products from Anatolia, Syria and beyond. Copper, vital for making bronze, often came by sea, sometimes in large oxhide ingots that have been found in shipwrecks. Tin, rarer and more distant in its sources, also moved along these maritime routes, changing hands multiple times before reaching Cretan furnaces. When a Minoan blacksmith in a town near Knossos hammered out a new hoe, a spearhead, or a votive double axe, he was shaping metal whose component parts had travelled hundreds or even thousands of kilometres. This constant movement of materials and finished products shaped not just the economy, but the image of Minoan power. To a villager in a distant Aegean island, the most tangible sign of Crete might not be soldiers or officials, but a beautifully made cup with a marine motif, traded in a harbour market. To an Egyptian scribe, Crete, perhaps remembered under a name like Keftiu, was one among several foreign regions that sent exotic goods and interesting people to the pharaoh's court. To a Levantine merchant, Minoan cloth or pottery was a reliable item in a portfolio of trade, something you could count on to find buyers in multiple directions. Behind this commercial network, scribes worked in the shadows of storerooms and harbour offices. We tend to imagine writing as something done by priests in temples or rulers inscribing their deeds on stone. In the Minoan world, as far as we can see, it was most often a tool of administration. On Crete, there were at least two main scripts before the arrival of Mycenaean Linear B, Cretan hieroglyphs and Linear A. Cretan hieroglyphs, as the name suggests, use small pictorial signs, human figures, animals, objects, sometimes carved into seals or written on clay. Linear A, by contrast, is more abstract. Straight lines and curves arranged in set combinations, pressed into tablets and roundels, painted on vessels, incised onto libation tables and other ritual objects. Both scripts almost certainly record the same or closely related languages that haven't survived in any later readable form. We know their signs, we can list them, classify them, track how their shapes change over time. In some cases, especially for Linear A, we can even guess at numerical signs and basic accounting formulas, because when the Mycenaeans later adapted this script into Linear B, they kept many of those numerical conventions. But the words themselves, the sounds, the grammar, those remain out of reach. The result is a curious mixture of clarity and opacity. You can stand in a museum and look at a small clay tablet from a Minoan harbour town. You can see that someone wrote in neat columns, that certain signs repeat in patterns that suggest headings and entries, that numerical signs appear next to what must be commodities. You can even say, with some confidence, that this is an account, perhaps recording shipments of oil, or allocations of grain to sailors, or contributions of wool from specific villages. But you can't say what those villages were called. You can't read the personal names of the people involved. You can't see the verbs that would tell you whether these goods were paid as tax, borrowed, offered in thanks to a deity, or assigned as rations. Beyond economic records, there are inscriptions on stone altars, offering tables and small religious objects. These must hold prayers, dedications, names of gods, or sacred places. Their presence tells us that writing wasn't confined to the counting house. It entered ritual life as well. But again, we can't read the words. We don't know what Minoans called their gods, what myths they told, what phrases they used when asking for protection at sea or giving thanks for a safe return. Because of this silence, some of the most basic questions about Minoan power remain unresolved. Did Knossos rule most of Crete as a centralized kingdom, or were there multiple relatively equal centers cooperating and competing through trade, marriage, and ritual alliances? Were the people who managed trade primarily secular officials, or did their authority come wrapped in priestly roles and religious symbolism? How did they think about debt, obligation, reciprocity? Did merchants operate with significant independence, or were most long-distance voyages planned and funded by palace administrations? The undeciphered scripts sit at the center of all these questions like a locked archive. The material evidence, palaces full of storage rooms, foreign goods in Cretan contexts, Cretan goods in foreign ones, shipwrecks with cargo that looks Minoan, foreign art showing Minoan-style figures, allows us to sketch an outline. We can say that the Minoans were deeply embedded in the maritime economy of the Eastern Mediterranean. We can see that their style, their crafts, their olive oil and wine and textiles and luxury goods moved widely. We can infer that some people on Crete became specialists in managing these flows, keeping accounts, coordinating production with demand. But without their words, without their lists of place names and titles and treaties, much of the political structure behind that economic reach remains blurry. What we can see clearly is the effect. From small harbours and open palaces, an island people turned their geography into an advantage. They traded oil and wine pressed from their hillsides, wool from their flocks, pottery, and crafted goods from their workshops, and in return drew in metal, prestige objects, and stories from lands farther east and south. If you were to fall asleep on a Cretan beach at night, listening to the soft slap of water against hulls, you might half dream of where those ships were going, past dark silhouettes of islands, toward distant deltas and crowded harbours, carrying with them jars of oil sealed in the shadow of Knossos, texts written in a script no one alive today can read, and an image of Crete as a place of abundance and skill. Over time, repeated voyage after voyage, that image hardened into reality in the minds of their neighbours. This is how a far-flung power can be built without conquest in the usual noisy sense. Not by marching armies across maps, but by sending out ships steadily, season after season, by filling foreign storerooms with your goods, by making your style the one others emulate or desire. The Minoans did this so effectively that, even after their palaces fell silent, echoes of their sea-born world persisted, in myths of island kingdoms, in borrowed motifs, and in the silent, inscrutable lines of their scripts waiting, still to be understood. If you could step off one of those ships and walk up into a Minoan town, the first thing that might strike you isn't the size of the buildings or the bustle of the streets. It's the colour, not just here and there, but everywhere. Walls that in most ancient places would be bare plaster or rough stone are painted. Doorways are framed with bands of red and black. Columns, not the tall stone shafts you might associate with later Greek temples, but tapering wooden ones, stand on smooth stone bases, their surfaces once coated in vivid pigments. Stairwells, corridors, rooms deep inside the palace are lined with scenes. Flowers, animals, people moving in procession, swirling patterns that make the whole space feel alive. This is one of the strange gifts of the Minoans. For a civilization whose words we can't read, whose political arrangements we can only guess at, they left behind an astonishing number of images. Frescoes on walls, designs on pottery, tiny carvings on seals and signet rings, gold and faience jewellery shaped into miniature worlds. Each of these is a small window into how they chose to see themselves and what they loved to look at. Walk slowly through that painted world. On one wall, you see dolphins gliding through blue water, their bodies curved in graceful arcs, smaller fish darting around them. They're not stiff or schematic. They're playful, almost whimsical. Someone took the time to capture the way a dolphin twists as it swims, the way light might fall on its back. On another wall, lilies rise from a rocky ground, their petals open, stems bending as if caught in a breeze. Above them, swallows swoop and circle. The same motifs reappear on pottery. Large storage jars, smaller jugs, delicate cups, all carry waves, spirals, octopuses with tentacles curling to fill every available space, shells, reeds, floating seaweed. It's as if the boundaries between land and sea, house and harbour, have blurred. In a world where so much depended on boats, storms and currents, perhaps that's not surprising. The sea wasn't just a background, it was part of the mental landscape. Even on tiny objects, seals cut from stone, meant to be pressed into clay to mark ownership or authorise a transaction, you find the same attention to the natural world. A crouching lion, a goat leaping over a rock, a cluster of reeds with a bird perched among them. These images are so small you could cover most with your thumbnail, yet they're full of movement. Jewellery adds another layer. Gold pendants shaped like bees facing each other, their wings spread wide. earrings with tiny granules of metal arranged in complex patterns, beads of semi-precious stone, faience, and glass in blues and greens that echo the sea and sky. These are not the heavy, rigid ornaments we sometimes associate with ancient elites. Many feel light, intricate, made to move with the body. Taken together, this visual world suggests a people deeply attuned to their surroundings. Flowers, waves, animals, rocky hillsides, open skies. These aren't decorative afterthoughts. They're central themes. If you spend your life in palaces with open courtyards, on terraces that catch the sea breeze, walking between mountain sanctuaries and coastal harbours, maybe this is where your eye naturally rests. But the images aren't only of nature. They're also of people. In many frescoes and carved scenes, men and women alike are shown with dark, curling hair, long, narrow waists, and elaborately patterned clothing. Men are often painted with reddish-brown skin, women with lighter, creamy tones, a convention shared with Egypt. Both seem carefully groomed. Hair is bound with ribbons or held in elaborate styles. Some wear bracelets, necklaces, earrings, and belts. The overall impression is not of rough, practical work clothes, but of outfits chosen to be seen. For women, especially in elite art, there's a distinctive style that appears again and again, flounced skirts or layered kilts that bell out from the hips, tightly fitted bodices that leave the breasts exposed, short puffed sleeves or no sleeves at all, embroidered or patterned aprons. It's an image so striking that it's become almost a shorthand for Minoan in modern reconstructions. Men often wear short kilts or loincloths, sometimes with elaborate patterns, sometimes plain. In some scenes they appear bare-chested. In others, wearing fitted garments. On seal stones and rings, you can find figures in long robes, perhaps indicating officials or ritual specialists. Hairstyles vary, some with long locks, others with close-cropped hair, sometimes tied into a small knot. From these pictures, it's tempting to extrapolate, to imagine what it felt like to dress for a feast in Knossos, to apply oil scented with local herbs, to smooth your hair, adjust your jewellery, step out into a courtyard where music is already beginning and torches are being lit. Archaeology does offer some supporting details, traces of cosmetics, stone palettes, small vessels that probably once held perfumed oils, bone and bronze pins and combs for arranging hair, drinking cups and serving vessels clustered in banquet spaces, fragments of musical instruments like lyres and possibly small flutes or pipes. Put those pieces together, and it doesn't seem far-fetched to imagine feasting and music as central features of elite life. Rooms in palaces are arranged in ways that suggest processions and gatherings, people moving along corridors, entering large halls, standing or reclining while food and drink circulate. Outside in courtyards, you can imagine larger crowds, the sound of pipes and drums echoing off painted walls, dancers moving in rhythm. The art itself sometimes shows these processions. Lines of figures walking, carrying vessels, offerings, or perhaps gifts. They move in orderly sequences, often toward a central person or sacred symbol. Men in kilts, women in patterned skirts. Some hold small cups, others larger containers. The overall tone is not chaotic or martial, but controlled, ceremonial. And then there are the bulls. From the first excavations at Knossos, large horns carved in stone, painted images of bulls, and above all, scenes of people interacting with bulls have captivated both scholars and the wider public. On fresco fragments, on seal stones, on gold rings, you see a recurring pattern, a powerful bull in mid-stride, head lowered, horns forward, and human figures in impossible positions around it. One clings to its horns, another somersaults over its back, a third lands gracefully behind. This is the famous bull-leaping imagery. What exactly are we looking at? One possibility is that we're seeing a real athletic practice. Perhaps young men and women, specially trained, performed acrobatic jumps over live bulls in courtyards as part of seasonal festivals. Supporters of this view point to parallels in later cultures with dangerous animal sports and to the anatomical accuracy of many bulls in the art. Others suggest a more symbolic or ritualized reading. Maybe these images compress multiple stages of a ceremony into a single composition, approach, leap, landing. Or perhaps they represent stories, myths, or ideals of bravery rather than everyday activities. There are even debates about whether the bulls were alive at all. Some scholars have proposed that they could be representations of exercise with dummy bulls or stylized performances with controlled animals rather than full-speed charges. The truth may never be fully recoverable. We have no instructions, no rule books, no Minoan voice explaining, "This is what we do with bulls, and here is why." What's clear is that the combination of human agility and animal power held enormous symbolic weight. Bulls appear in many contexts, as motifs on big ceremonial axes, as heads carved into drinking vessels, as small figurines in shrines. The act of confronting, mastering, or dancing with such a creature seems to have mattered in some deep way. In many of these bull-leaping scenes, the participants appear to include both male and female figures. That brings us to another striking feature of Minoan art, the prominence of women. On walls and rings and seal stones, women are not confined to the edges. They stand in the center of processions. They sit on raised seats while others approach. They hold ritual objects, possibly staffs, libation jugs, or symbols of authority. In some scenes, a seated woman is flanked by attendants, her hair elaborately styled, her clothing richly patterned. Scholars have long wondered, are these images of goddesses, queens, priestesses, or some blend of these categories, in a system we don't fully understand? It is tempting to leap from these images to big claims about Minoan society, that it was matriarchal, or that women held unusually high status compared to other Bronze Age cultures. Some, older interpretations imagined a peaceful, goddess-centered world where women ruled and men played secondary roles. Modern scholarship is more cautious. Art is not a transparent photograph of reality. It's shaped by conventions, by what patrons want to display, by the symbolic systems of the time. A woman shown large and central in a ritual scene might be a deity, not a human leader, or she might be both at once in the eyes of participants, embodying a divine role during a ceremony. Male power might be expressed in other contexts we see less often, perhaps in hunting, warfare, or administration, where the art hasn't survived as well or was never made in the same quantity. What we can say is that elite women in Minoan Crete were highly visible in the imagery that has come down to us, often in positions of ritual importance. They're not merely onlookers, they're actors in the painted and carved dramas. Whether that visibility translates directly into political power is a question the surviving evidence can't yet answer. And that tension between vivid presence and frustrating gaps runs through every aspect of Minoan art. The frescoes we have are mostly fragments, carefully reassembled like giant jigsaw puzzles with many missing pieces. Colours have faded, plasters have crumbled, edges have been lost. Some famous scenes you might see in books or museums are partly modern reconstructions, guided by archaeologists' best guesses. Pottery survives unevenly. Delicate cups and lavishly painted vases are more likely to have been treasured, buried, and found than plain everyday bowls that broke and were thrown away. Seals and jewellery tend to come from graves or hoards, contexts that already privilege certain kinds of objects and owners. So when we look at these things and try to imagine the beauty of their world, we have to remember how selective our window is. We're seeing the top layers of an elite aesthetic, mostly from palatial and high-status contexts. We're seeing what lasts: stone, fired clay, gold, while wood, fabric, and flesh have vanished. We're seeing images without captions, performances without scripts. And yet, even through all those filters, something clear and distinctive comes through. A love of flowing forms and movement. An eye for the patterns of sea and shore, flower and animal. A pleasure in clothing and adornment, in carefully arranged hair and bright textiles. A fascination with ritual, procession, and the charged moment when human beings place themselves in the path of powerful forces, whether bulls, gods, or the sea itself. When you finally step back from the showcases and reconstructed walls, what lingers is a sense of elegance, of lightness, of a visual language that feels unusually fluid for such an ancient time. It's easy to forget how fragmentary the evidence is because the pieces we do have are so compelling. The palaces are mostly ruins now. The songs, the perfumes, the touch of textiles against skin are gone. But on surviving shards of plaster and clay, in tiny carvings and delicate gold, the Minoans left us glimpses of what delighted their eyes. In the next part of our journey, we'll follow those same eyes beyond palaces and feasts, out into caves, mountain tops, and sacred spaces where beauty, danger, and devotion met in ways we're only beginning to trace. Follow those eyes up the hills. You leave the painted walls and polished floors behind. The stone paving of the palace gives way to rougher paths, then to narrow tracks worn into the earth by countless feet. The air changes as you climb, less scented by cooking fires and animals, more by thyme and wild sage crushed under sandals. The sea falls away behind you. The land opens. High on a ridge, the path levels out, and you arrive at something that, at first, barely looks like anything at all. A low enclosure of stones, a scatter of broken pottery, a few upright slabs, weathered smooth by wind. No grand temple, no towering colonnades, just a place where the ground has been marked, again and again, as special. Archaeologists call these sites peak sanctuaries. They're small, often simple, perched on mountaintops or ridges across Crete. What makes them remarkable isn't their architecture, it's their pattern. From around the Middle Bronze Age onward, you find them repeating, little platforms, enclosures, clusters of offerings, shards of cups and small vessels, terracotta figurines, horns shaped from clay or stone. Thousands of small objects carried up these slopes, left deliberately, then broken by time. Stand here for a moment in your mind. Imagine what this hilltop might have been on a certain day in the Minoan year. The sky is wide, wind tugs at clothing, whips hair into your face. You can see other hills, valleys, maybe even glints of the sea. Below somewhere is your town, your fields, your sheep and goats grazing on the slopes. Above you, nothing but sky. This is not a private household shrine. It's exposed, communal, visible from far away. People from the town below climb up here together, perhaps people from neighbouring settlements too, each carrying something small in their hands. We know some of what they carried. Archaeologists have found tiny figurines of human beings, arms raised. Rough, almost blocky sometimes, not graceful god statues in marble, but thumb-sized bodies in clay or stone, shaped by many hands of varying skill. There are animals too, cattle, sheep, goats, birds, little duplicates of the living creatures that fed and clothed people down in the valleys. Some interpret the human figures as worshippers, frozen in the act of raising their arms to the sky. Others see them as deities themselves, captured in a standard gesture of blessing or power. It could be both, at different times, in different minds. Alongside the figurines, one symbol appears again and again, a pair of stylized horns, two upward curves, often with a hollow space between, sometimes perched on stone platforms, sometimes carved into building corners or set on walls. Arthur Evans, the early excavator of Knossos, called them horns of consecration, and the name has stuck, even if the original meaning is still debated. Are they literal bull's horns, marking a space as dedicated to a bull god? Are they an abstract sign for something else? Mountains, perhaps, or a sacred gate between worlds? Whatever their origin by the height of the palatial period, these horns proliferate. On roofs, at entrances, in courtyards, in shrines. They seem to signal, this place is set apart. Another recurring symbol turns up on altars, on seal stones, even in carved relief. The double axe, the labries. Unlike the single-bladed axes you'd use to chop wood, these have two mirrored blades, often symmetrical, sometimes elaborately decorated. Real bronze double axes have been found, some massive and ceremonial, far too large and delicate for practical use. Others are tiny, more like charms or tokens. The double axe appears in contexts that feel ritual, nailed to walls, set in shrines, buried in special deposits. Later, Greek myths will remember Crete as the land of the labyrinth, possibly related to the word labris, and of course the Minotaur trapped in its depths. But in Minoan times, the double axe doesn't obviously signal anything monstrous. It might have had agricultural, celestial, or divine associations. It might have been a tool of sacrifice. It might have been a badge of authority in the hands of certain officiants. We're deep in the territory of educated guessing now. When we step into Minoan religion, we enter a space where evidence is rich in details, but poor in explanations. There are shrines, sanctuaries, offerings, symbols, but almost no texts we can read that say, this is the god, this is the festival, this is what it means. So scholars look for patterns instead. One pattern is where sacred places appear, not only on peaks, but in caves. Crete is riddled with caves, some large enough to hold crowds, others narrow fissures where you have to stoop. Long before the Minoans, Neolithic people sheltered in these spaces. During the Bronze Age, some caves take on a new role. They become sanctuaries. Deep inside, archaeologists find deposits of pottery, votive figurines, bronze objects. In one famous cave at Sycro, on the slopes below Mount Dicta, offerings accumulated over centuries, miniature double axes, bronze knives, pins, jewellery, tiny models of limbs, possibly left in hopes of healing. For later Greeks, this cave would be remembered as the birthplace of Zeus. For the Minoans, centuries earlier, its meaning is less clear, but unmistakably sacred. If a peak sanctuary connects the earth to the sky, a cave sanctuary reverses the axis. You move downward into cool darkness, into the belly of the hill. Water drips, echoes distort sound. The air smells of damp stone. You can imagine torches, the flicker of light on stalagmites and natural columns, the way shadows would move as people chanted, poured liquid, placed offerings on ledges or in pools. Caves, in many cultures, become places where the living can brush against the underworld, or the womb of the earth, or the home of a powerful being. It would be surprising if some version of that intuition wasn't present here. Between peaks and caves are many smaller sacred spots woven into everyday life. In houses and palaces, archaeologists have uncovered small rooms or corners that seem to function as shrines. A low bench, a niche, a few ritual vessels, a small clay figure, a set of horns of consecration, sometimes miniature altars. These aren't grand public spaces. They feel intimate, domestic, perhaps tied to family rituals, household deities, or the private side of a broader cult. On seal stones and gold rings, scenes appear that seem to show rituals in action. A woman standing on a platform between horns of consecration, arms raised as another figure approaches carrying a vessel. A person seated beneath a stylized tree or standing on a stepped structure, as if on a stage or a terrace. A small shrine with columns and open doors, flanked by symbols. In some images, a tiny bird perches on the roof or the sacred object, as if signalling divine presence. In others, you see something stranger, floating objects in the air, double axes, horns, even shrines themselves, hovering above worshippers. Are these literal depictions of hanging cult objects, or symbolic ways of saying, here, invisible to our eyes, the sacred is present? The human figures in these ritual scenes often resemble the elaborately dressed women from frescoes, flounced skirts, exposed breasts, tall headdresses, rich jewellery. Sometimes they sit on a raised seat while others stand below. Sometimes they perform libations, pouring liquid from a jug into a basin or onto the ground. Are we looking at priestesses, queens, goddesses, or all at once? Evans believed in a powerful great goddess at the heart of Minoan religion, perhaps a nature or fertility deity associated with mountains, animals, and vegetation. He saw her everywhere, in the famous snake goddess figurines holding serpents in each hand, in images of a woman flanked by lions, in figures standing beneath sacred trees. Later scholars have challenged the idea of a single, all-encompassing mother goddess, suggesting instead a more complex, perhaps regional pantheon of female and male deities. It's entirely possible that multiple goddesses were venerated, one associated with mountains and wild places, another with the household and hearth, another with the sea and storms, another with birth and growth. Male divine figures might have been present too, young gods, consorts, protectors of flocks or weather. Some scenes show male figures approaching a central female. Others show men in positions of ritual prominence themselves. Without text, though, names and myths remain blank. What does emerge with some clarity is that whatever beings they revered, the line between sacred and political, between religious ceremony and social display, may not have been sharply drawn. Think back to the palaces, big central courts, long processional ways, painted walls, storerooms full of surplus. These were not just administrative centres, they were also stages. If a ruler or a council of elites also embodied priestly roles, leading festivals, hosting processions, overseeing sacrifices, then religious authority and worldly power would have been tightly intertwined. A procession climbing from a town to a peak sanctuary, carrying offerings, might also be a demonstration of loyalty to the palace that organises the ritual. The same applies in reverse. Envoys from a palace visiting a distant sanctuary could be asserting influence over the communities that use that place. Altars and horns of consecration on palace roofs would then signal not only devotion to the gods, but the palace's role as mediator between humans and the divine. Offerings themselves tell part of that story. In some sanctuaries, you find simple clay figurines and plain cups, things ordinary people could afford. In others, especially caves or certain shrines, you find finely worked bronze, gold, imported objects, prestige goods that only elites could have dedicated. The gods, it seems, received gifts from all levels of society, but not of equal value. The rituals that accompanied those offerings are easier to imagine than to prove. Libations, pouring out liquids like wine, oil, honey, or water, are strongly suggested by the many special vessels with spouts and basins. Animal sacrifice is likely, given the prevalence of knives, horns, and bones in some contexts, though direct evidence is patchy. Burnt offerings, incense, and food gifts probably featured as well. Dance and music, so central to Minoan art in other contexts, almost certainly played roles in festivals and rites. Some scenes on rings show people in what might be ecstatic postures, arms thrown back, bodies arched as if in trance or intense emotion. Trees are sometimes shown being shaken or embraced, a gesture that might signify contact with the divine presence residing in living nature. But for every scene that seems clear, there's another that refuses easy interpretation. A tiny boat beneath a shrine, a figure stepping into or out of a patterned rectangle that might represent a gate, or a building, or something else entirely. A woman standing on the roof of a structure, with birds landing around her. A man grasping the horns of a bull, not in mid-leap but in a steady grip that looks almost like an embrace. Are these myths that everyone on Crete would have known, the way modern cultures know their folk tales? Are they local legends tied to specific valleys and caves, seasonal dramas reenacted each year? One village's sacred story might have been unknown 50 miles away, or perhaps certain core myths travelled along trade routes, shared and reshaped across regions. What Minoan religion seems to have done, above all, is stitch together a whole landscape. Peaks, caves, springs, groves and palaces, each punctuated by small signs of devotion. A hilltop with its scatter of figurines, a cave with its silent hoard of bronze axes, a household corner with a single clay image, a palace court where hundreds gather to watch a ritual dance. When people from different towns met at a common sanctuary, they weren't just exchanging goods. They were participating in shared rites, invoking shared powers. In that sense, religion may have been one of the threads that held Minoan Crete together, not as a single unified state, perhaps, but as a network of communities who recognized the same sacred places and similar sacred signs. Yet for all that, so much remains open. We can map where shrines and sanctuaries are. We can count figurines and axes. We can trace the spread of horns of consecration from small rural sites to the roofs of great palaces. We can compare ritual scenes on rings and seals, lining them up like frames from a lost film. What we can't do, at least not yet, is hear the words spoken in those places. We don't know what prayers sounded like in a mountain wind, or how people named the powers they felt in caves. We don't know what stories parents whispered to children about the goddess of the hills, or the spirit of the spring, or the bull that died and rose again with the seasons. We don't know exactly why one person chose to dedicate a small clay goat, another a bronze axe, another a handful of grain poured onto a stone. All of that, the inner meaning, the emotional texture, is mostly gone. What remains are traces, the worn threshold of a cave, the pattern of broken pottery, the stubborn recurrence of certain forms, the horn, the axe, the raised arms, the bull, the woman on the platform. Enough to be sure that beneath the surface of Minoan life, an intricate web of beliefs and rituals once guided the rhythm of days and seasons. In the next part of our journey, that calm rhythm will be interrupted. The same mountains that held sanctuaries, the same sea that linked shrines and palaces, will become sources of sudden violence. The earth will move, the water will rise, and whatever prayers the Minoans uttered in their caves and on their peaks, they will be spoken into a world about to change. The first sign is not fire or smoke, but a tremor. You're in a town on northern Crete, maybe at Malea or Knossos, going about the usual tasks of a late afternoon, potters trimming the rims of fresh vessels, scribes at their tablets, someone sweeping a courtyard scattered with olive leaves from the last wind. The sea is where it always is, a calm blue band on the horizon. Then the floor shifts. Just slightly. A bowl rattles on a shelf. A dog lifts its head and whines. On Crete, earthquakes are not rare. People are used to the occasional shudder. Buildings are built with that in mind. Stones carefully fitted, wooden beams laced through walls to give them a little flexibility. So the first tremor might not alarm anyone. Maybe there's a pause, a look exchanged, a hand braced on a doorframe. Then life resumes. But the tremor comes again, harder. A dull, deep sound rolls through the ground like a giant grinding its teeth somewhere under the island. Far away to the north, beyond the horizon, a small volcanic island in the Aegean has entered a phase that modern geologists call paroxysmal eruption. To the people living then, it would have been something beyond words. We call the island Thera, or Santorini. In the Bronze Age, it was a near-perfect ring of land around a central volcanic cone, a jewel along the trade routes between Crete and the Greek mainland. At some point in the mid-second millennium BCE, that cone tore itself apart. What happened there has been compared to the most powerful eruptions humans have ever recorded. Vast columns of ash and pumice shot into the sky, darkening the sun. The centre of the island collapsed into its magma chamber, creating the great caldera we see today. Waves of superheated gas and rock roared across the sea surface. The landscape of Thera itself was essentially erased. For Minoan Crete, this eruption has become the event everyone circles back to when they ask, what went wrong? In older histories, the eruption of Thera is sometimes presented almost like a myth of judgment. A prosperous, peaceful island civilization, a sudden explosion, a tsunami sweeping everything away in a single apocalyptic day, the destruction of Atlantis under another name. The reality, as far as we can piece it together, is more complicated, more drawn out, and in some ways even more unsettling. First, the ash. When Thera erupted, winds carried fine volcanic ash across much of the eastern Mediterranean. On Crete, layers of this ash have been found in some places, but they're thinner than you might expect. Enough to leave a clear geological fingerprint, not enough to bury entire cities under meters of debris. In coastal marshes, in lake beds, in the seafloor, scientists find microscopic glass shards from Thera's eruption. On land, in a few spots, there are visible bands of grey within the soil, like thin smudges between older and younger layers. Ashfall of that kind wouldn't have instantly suffocated the island, but it could have dusted fields, clogged cisterns, poisoned grazing lands if it piled up on leaves and pasture. It might have turned one or two harvests unreliable, contaminated water supplies, stressed flocks and herds. Even a slight disruption repeated over months could ripple through a system that depended on carefully timed planting and trade. Then the sea. When the central part of Thera collapsed, huge volumes of water rushed in. The sudden displacement, likely triggered tsunamis that spread outward across the Aegean. Models and field studies suggest waves several meters high, maybe more, in confined bays, radiating south toward Crete. On the north coast of Crete, in low-lying areas, archaeologists have found odd deposits, chaotic mixes of marine shells, pebbles from the shore, and broken pottery thrown inland beyond where ordinary storms would reach. At places like Palicastro and Malea, there are signs that buildings near the water were damaged, walls knocked out of alignment, floors scoured. But the pattern isn't uniform. Not every northern site shows clear tsunami evidence. Some palaces and towns seem to have weathered this phase with less obvious damage. Inland sites, or those tucked a bit higher on slopes, may have heard the roar and seen the retreat of the sea, but not felt the full physical force. And under all of this, earthquakes. The Aegean is a tectonically restless region. A major volcanic event like Thera's eruption doesn't happen in isolation. It's likely that in the years leading up to the main blast, and possibly in the years after, communities across Crete experienced a sequence of quakes, some small, some large enough to crack walls, topple storage jars, send people running into the open. In the archaeological record, you sometimes see a layer of destruction where walls have collapsed. Floors are littered with fallen stones and smashed pottery, and then, sitting right on top of that chaos, neat new floors and rebuilt walls. That suggests that at least some destructive events were followed quickly by rebuilding. Minoan communities, at least for a while, were resilient. This is where the story becomes less like a single catastrophe and more like a long, exhausting ordeal. Imagine several years in which the ground is untrustworthy, shaking often enough that you never quite relax. Imagine a strange haze in the sky some months, redder sunsets, ash on distant waters. Imagine rumours arriving with traders, an island to the north gone, its ports destroyed, its fields buried. Imagine a day when the sea, always your ally, surges in and tears apart warehouses, boats, quays. When it retreats, it leaves behind wreckage instead of profit. Thera itself had been part of the broader Minoan world. Its town of Crete, beautifully preserved under volcanic ash, shows wall paintings, storage jars and architecture that tie it closely to Crete. Ships from Thera would have carried goods, news and connections up and down the routes that sustained Minoan influence. When Crete vanished under Pomis, it removed a stepping stone from that seaborne network. Trade routes could be rerouted, yes, merchants are adaptable, but shifting the flow of goods and information always benefits some and harms others. Ports that once thrived might have found themselves bypassed. Old monopolies might have cracked. All of this, the ash, the earthquakes, the tsunamis, the trade disruptions, sounds dramatic. But how much of it directly hit Crete, and when, is still debated. Dating the eruption of Thera itself has been a long-running puzzle. Radiocarbon measurements from organic material buried in the ash have suggested a date around the late 1600s BCE, Egyptian historical chronologies, which Minoan artifacts are sometimes tied to, once seem to point a bit later. Scholars still argue about which anchors are firmer, how to reconcile tree-ring evidence with historical king lists, how to account for regional variations. The result is that while almost everyone agrees the eruption was enormous, there isn't complete agreement about exactly where it sits relative to the phases of Minoan palace life. Did it strike in the very heart of their so-called Neopalatial peak? Or a little before, or right as power was already beginning to shift? How much time passed between the blast in the north and the clear signs of crisis on Crete? Even on the island itself, the pattern of damage is uneven. At some sites on the north and east coasts, there are levels of destruction that archaeologists tentatively link to tsunami or earthquake activity around the time of Thera's eruption. Buildings crushed, pottery left in situ as if people left in a hurry or died where they stood. Burn layers in some places, though fire can result from many causes. Elsewhere, the story is softer. Gradual changes in pottery style, modifications to buildings instead of total ruin, signs of continuing occupation without an obvious break. Knossos, for example, seems to sail through this period in relative strength, at least at first glance. while other palaces on Crete show signs of major destruction in the later 15th century BCE. Knossos remains occupied, elaborately rebuilt, influential. Some scholars think it may even have taken advantage of others' misfortunes to centralize power. So the eruption of Thera doesn't appear as a clean, island-wide line of before and after. In some places it may have been a devastating blow, in others a shove rather than a knockout. This is where the idea of environmental shock becomes useful. Imagine Minoan Crete as a web of interlocking systems: agriculture, herding, woodworking, metallurgy, trade, religion, politics. For centuries, these systems had been in dynamic balance, adjusting to small changes in climate, population, and external contact. Now, add a series of unusual events over, say, a generation. A major eruption that darkens the skies for a time and rains ash on parts of the island. A cluster of larger-than-usual earthquakes, one or more tsunamis that rip into coastal installations. The loss of a crucial partner island that once mediated trade to the north. Maybe, as some climate reconstructions hint, slight shifts in rainfall patterns and temperatures in the following decades. None of these alone would necessarily topple a sophisticated maritime culture, but together they would stress it. Storerooms carefully stockpiled for lean years might be called on more often. Elites, used to displaying wealth through feasts and rituals, might find their surpluses shrinking, their ability to reward followers eroding. Repair work would compete with new building projects. Farmers might abandon marginal lands that had become too risky. Merchants might start to look for new partners, on the Greek mainland in Anatolia, further east. In that kind of environment, old certainties start to wobble. Religious centres damaged by quakes or tsunamis might lose some of their aura. Shrines that escaped damage might gain it. Political alliances could be reshuffled as some families or regions prove better able to adapt than others. External powers, watching from across the sea, might notice vulnerability where there had once been strength. When you look at the archaeology of Crete in the century or so after Thera's eruption, you don't see a simple silence, you see rebuilding. You see continued artistry, trade, and ritual. You also see increasingly fortifications in some areas, influences from Mycenaean Greece seeping into material culture, and eventually widespread destruction at many palatial sites around the mid-1400s BCE. If Thera had truly wiped the Minoans out overnight, the layers would be cleaner, a thick band of ash, an absence of rebuilding, a clear abandonment horizon across the island. That's not what appears. Instead, Thera hovers like a dark star in the background, obviously important, clearly disruptive, but not in a way that lets us point to a single, fatal day. In a sense, this only deepens the mystery, because even after the earth shook and the sea surged, even after an island to the north disappeared in fire, Minoan Crete did not vanish. It staggered, adapted, persisted. Ships still sailed, palaces still functioned. People still climbed to peak sanctuaries and descended into caves, carrying offerings and prayers. Yet something in the balance of power was shifting. When the final wave of destructions came to many Cretan palaces, a century or more after Thera's eruption, that older shock may have made them more vulnerable, economically, socially, perhaps even psychologically. The eruption, then, is less a neat answer than a haunting prelude, a reminder that even the most confident societies live at the mercy of forces they can't control, and a hint that by the time foreign powers appeared on the horizon, the great island civilization of the Minoans might already have been walking a narrower ledge than their art and architecture suggest. In the next part of our journey, we'll watch that ledge crumble further, not under ash and waves, but under the quieter pressure of human ambition, rivalry, and takeover. When the next wave of destruction comes, it doesn't arrive with the drama of a volcano. There's no single thunderclap you can point to, no towering plume of ash, no wall of water roaring across the shallows. Instead, what you see, if you are standing on Crete in those later centuries, is a pattern that only makes sense in hindsight. A palace burns here. Another is abandoned there. A set of storerooms is smashed and never refilled. A great hall's painted plaster slides off in flakes, and no one bothers to repaint it. On a calm evening at Phaistos, the sun sets the way it always has, washing the courtyard in gold. But the next morning, smoke rises from the upper floors. Whether from earthquake damage, accident, civil strife, or an enemy's torch, we can't say with certainty. We can only see the aftermath: fallen beams, cracked paving stones, broken pithoi, a scatter of once precious objects now trapped in the collapse. At Malea, a similar story. At Zakros on the far eastern shore, sites that had been nodal points in the island's networked life suddenly show what archaeologists call destruction horizons. Thin but unmistakable bands in the earth where everything changes. Below that line, order, routine, accumulation. Above it, rubble, ash, or simply a different way of building and living. These destruction layers tend to cluster in the later 15th century BCE, long after Thera's eruption. They're not identical from place to place. Some show clear fire, others look more like earthquake damage. Some are accompanied by evidence of hurried abandonment, as if people had time to grab portable valuables. Others feel more like abrupt endings, vessels left in place, doors blocked by fallen masonry, as if time stopped. What's striking is not just that these palaces suffer, but that one in particular seems to stand apart. Knossos. For a while, as other centres flicker or go dark, Knossos continues. Its palace is rebuilt, reconfigured, perhaps even expanded. Storerooms are restocked. Workshops hum. Administrative systems, whatever they looked like in daily practice, continue to operate. And somewhere in this phase, the character of that system begins to shift. To see it, archaeologists turn to the small, unassuming things that survive when walls don't. Pots, weapons, jewellery, seals, graves, and crucially, clay tablets. For most of Minoan history, the script we find impressed into wet clay is what we call Linear A. It's a set of signs that record something, likely a language native to Crete, but that we still cannot read with confidence. Its tablets feel Minoan in context, associated with local palaces, local cults, local patterns of storage and redistribution. But in the later stages of Gnosis's life, another script appears among the debris of offices and storerooms. Its signs look similar, probably adapted from the older system, but the language beneath is different. This newer script is Linear B, and Linear B we can read. It's an early form of Greek. On the surface, the tablets it leaves behind are dry administrative snippets, lists of wool, bronze, oil, chariot parts, names of officials, allocations to shrines, distributions of grain. They don't tell stories in the way we might like. They don't say, in this year, the men from the mainland arrived. They don't narrate a conquest, but they do something almost as startling. They show us that at some point, the central bureaucracy of Knossos was operating in Greek. This is the clearest fingerprint of Mycenaean influence, the world of the mainland palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos and Thebes, reaching deeply into Cretan life. The shift is visible not only in writing, but in objects. In graves, especially in the north and east of Crete, the old Minoan habit of group burials in communal tombs lives alongside something new. Individual warrior graves furnished with long slashing swords of mainland type, boar's tusk helmets, and other equipment that would look at home in a Mycenaean shaft grave. Some houses begin to contain pottery styles that echo designs from the Argolid and beyond, stirrup jars with mainland forms, painted motifs that blend Cretan and Greek tastes. Seal stones, once dominated by swirling Minoan marine and floral patterns, start to show more rigid, martial scenes, chariots, spearmen, iconography that speaks a slightly different language of power. Even the architecture hints at this slow turning of the wheel. Fortified features, ramparts, more defensible positions, become more common on the mainland in this era, and on Crete, once proud palatial centres with open, wall-less courts start to show more concern for control and separation. Not a sudden transformation into a fortress culture, but a subtle thickening of barriers, a narrowing of thresholds. How did this happen? Older accounts used to imagine a simple story: Mycenaean Greeks, emboldened by their own rising power and sensing weakness in a post-Thera Crete, launch an invasion. Ships full of armoured warriors cross the narrow sea, sack the palaces, install their own rulers, and impose their language. The appeal of that narrative is obvious. It gives us a moment, a date, a before and after as clean as a sword stroke. But when you look closely at the earth, that clean line refuses to appear. In some Cretan sites, you see mainland-style objects appearing before any clear destruction horizon. In others, the destruction comes first, and the Mycenaean elements show up only later, in rebuilding phases. There are places where local pottery traditions continue seemingly uninterrupted, even as linear B tablets start to appear not so far away. There are tombs where old Minoan forms and new Mycenaean fashions mingle in the same burial, as if families are carefully balancing two identities at once. All of this suggests that what we're looking at is not a single invasion in the Hollywood sense, but a more complex process. Perhaps there was military action at some points, raids, seizures of key ports. The archaeological record preserves weapons, trauma on bones, burned buildings that point to violent episodes. But layered over that are signs of something slower. Intermarriage between Cretan elites and mainland dynasties, economic dependency as mainland powers increasingly control metals and trade routes, ambitious local factions that align themselves with Mycenaean styles as a way to signal status or new loyalties. It's possible to imagine a scenario where Knossos, after the other palaces fall or weaken, invites or is forced to accept mainland advisors, scribes, and perhaps even rulers. A cohabitation at first, then a gradual tipping of authority. The same halls that once echoed with a non-Greek tongue now host administrators who think and record in Greek, while the farmers in the countryside still speak their old language in fields and villages. The same sanctuaries that once received offerings under purely Minoan rites now accumulate dedications from people whose gods have different names, even if they stand in the same wind and face the same sacred peaks. This is takeover not as a single battle, but as a decades-long shifting of centre of gravity. And yet, for all this change, Minoan traditions don't simply vanish. In the art, produced under what looks like Mycenaean control, you still find spirals of sea life, lilies curling in painted friezes, graceful figures in flounced skirts and bare chests. Some religious spaces, especially in caves and on mountaintops, continue to be used deep into the late Bronze Age. Old gods, or at least old sacred places, refuse to yield easily. Even the linear B tablets from Knossos, though written in Greek, reference deities whose names may mask older Cretan divinities beneath newly Hellenized pronunciations. We glimpse Potnia, the lady, a powerful mistress figure who may be a mainland echo of long-venerated island goddesses. In rural sites, the continuity is even stronger. People still press olives, plant barley, tend sheep. Local pottery workshops keep turning out Cretan shapes, even as fashions change in the palace. Children learn to navigate the same terraces and ravines, the same paths to hilltop shrines, long after distant scribes switch languages. From a distance of 3,500 years, these overlapping continuities and breaks blur. Standing in an excavation trench, an archaeologist sees only the cross-section of time. Here, a floor surface with Minoan-style pottery sitting on it. Above that, a thin smear of ash and rubble. Above that, a new floor, with slightly different walls and Mycenaean-type vessels. The temptation is to draw a simple line across that section and write conquest or collapse. It feels neat. It satisfies our longing for stories with clear climaxes. But the earth never quite cooperates. The phrase vanished overnight is powerful. It captures the shock we feel when confronted with a civilization that leaves behind palaces, art, and writing, and then seems to withdraw from the stage. For the Minoans, though, that phrase is probably more metaphor than fact. Their palatial system, the network of great courts and storerooms and central administrations, does reach a kind of abrupt end in many places. Within a couple of generations, the old pattern of multiple Cretan palaces, each with its own orbit of towns and sanctuaries, gives way to something more like a single Mycenaean-leaning hegemony centred at Knossos, and then, eventually, to a more fragmented landscape. But the people of Crete do not blink out of existence. Their language may linger in place names and cult terms. Their practices continue in household rituals, in the ways fields are laid out, in certain gestures of dress and dance that leave only faint shadows in our record. What archaeology preserves most clearly are endings, fires that bake clay tablets hard enough to survive, collapses that trap objects where they fell, abandonments that seal rooms and leave them untouched until a trowel finds them again. We are biased, structurally, toward moments of crisis because they leave the loudest traces. What gets lost is the texture of quiet transitions. A generation that grows up bilingual, a local chief who switches allegiance, a priestess who keeps an old rite alive under a new name. These things rarely leave a neat layer in the soil. So when we look at the shift from Minoan to Mycenaean dominance on Crete, we're trying to reconstruct a long, uneasy twilight from a series of brief flashes. Here, a linear B-tablet fragment in a burnt archive room. There, a warrior's grave on a hillside that once looked out over Minoan fleets. Somewhere else, a reoccupied house, its walls patched, its courtyard shrunk, its shrine niche still in use. Was there a final day when the last independent Minoan ruler was deposed? Maybe. But if it happened, it's buried in a jumble of stones that look much like the debris of any other earthquake or accidental fire. What we can see, clearly, is that by the time the story of the Bronze Age moves on, toward the world that later Greek myth would remember, the balance of power in the Aegean has shifted. The voices speaking from palace tablets are Greek. The great fortresses on the mainland, not the open courts of Crete, anchor the political map. The island that once seemed to orchestrate trade and style now plays a different, more subdued role. In the layers above the last Minoan palaces, the past is not entirely gone. It's there in fragments, a reused stone block carved long ago, a motif copied without full understanding, a cult place visited out of habit. A civilization, it turns out, does not need to end with an apocalyptic day to feel like it disappeared. It can also fade through slow replacement, through quiet compromises, through stories that stop being told. What survives for us are the broken pieces, charred beams, scattered figurines, tablets whose language we can read, and others whose symbols remain opaque, shards of a narrative with too many missing pages. From those fragments, we try to guess not only how the Minoans lived, but how they ceded their place, partly pushed by disaster, partly edged aside by ambitious neighbours, partly undone from within by stresses we can only dimly sense. In the final part of our journey, we'll step back from the takeover itself and look at what the Minoans left behind, in objects, in myths, and perhaps in the deeper patterns of how we imagine the rise and fall of civilizations. When you walk through a Minoan site today, you move through absences that still somehow feel full. A staircase that goes nowhere, its upper stories long vanished. A line of great storage jars, their mouths empty now, still waiting for oil or grain. A corridor that once smelled of incense and warm plaster, opening onto a courtyard that heard thousands of footsteps, now hearing only wind. From those fragments, a picture emerges of what the Minoans left behind. They were, as far as we can tell, among Europe's first great maritime specialists. Long before Athens or Corinth built their fleets, Cretan sailors were learning every mood of the Aegean. They read wind and current the way your forager ancestors read plants and tracks. They turned a rocky island into the hub of a web that reached to Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Cyclades. Pottery styles spread with them, weights and measures, artistic motifs, perhaps even certain ritual practices flowed along the same watery routes. Later, Greeks seem to have remembered this power in the only language that truly lasts, myth. They spoke of King Minos, who ruled the sea so thoroughly that his navy needed no walls. They told of a labyrinth at Knossos, a bewildering complex where a monster waited in the dark. Stand in the ruins of the palace's twisting corridors, its staircases that double back on themselves, its hidden magazines and light wells, and it's not hard to see how a visiting mainlander centuries later might turn architecture into story. The Minotaur itself, a creature both human and bull, may echo the bull-leaping scenes, the horned altars the deep importance of cattle across the island's art and ritual. Or perhaps it's a Greek way of talking about something more abstract, the fear of an older, foreign power that once dominated them, now reduced to a monster that a hero can finally slay. But if myth remembers the outline, it does not give us the details we crave. Those details may lie, trapped in the neat lines of linear A signs impressed into clay. Hundreds of tablets recording lists, offerings, maybe even something more? We don't know. Their script sits on the edge of comprehension, familiar in shape, opaque in sound. That silence is part of what makes the Minoans feel so haunting. We can hear their Mycenaean successors clearly through Linear B, but the Minoans themselves speak to us only in images. A girl poised in mid-leap over a charging bull, dolphins sliding across a painted wall, a goddess or priestess raising her arms in a gesture we no longer understand. Their ending, too, stays just out of reach. No single catastrophe explains it all. Thera's eruption, earthquakes, possible droughts, shifts in trade routes, internal strains, and the slow pressure of Mycenaean expansion all fold together into a gradual unravelling. There is no one day we can point to and say, here is where it all stopped. There is only a narrowing of horizons, a changing of languages, a transfer of power that leaves their palaces quiet. And yet they endure. In the myths that later Greeks told around their own fires, in the technical knowledge of shipbuilding and seafaring that did not have to be reinvented from nothing, in faint threads of religious practice, peak sanctuaries, cave cults, powerful female divinities that may have flowed into later Greek ritual under new names. Most of all, they endure in the experience of walking those ruins today. The bright shards of fresco, the worn thresholds, the view from a palace terrace out over the same blue sea, a brilliant civilization glimpsed in flashes framed by long stretches of silence. If you'd like to drift off with more quiet journeys into the ancient world, you can support this channel by gently tapping like, leaving a comment, and subscribing so you don't miss future stories. And if you're still awake, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight?